Hi everyone. After I uploaded the last video, the fact that anyone watched it or commented, it kind of did a little bit better than I thought it might, so I thought I'd do another video. And rather than harp on about Trench Crusade, which I will talk about, and I do want to sort of talk about my experience playing in campaigns with it, I thought I'd actually talk about something else that I've always found really interesting, and all mention of it seems to have sort of disappeared, and that's the Aliens vs Predator miniatures game, The Hunt Begins, by Prodos Games. It's a game that went to Kickstarter in 2013 and is now infamous for being really a failure, which is insane considering the scope and the size of the license and the popularity of the license. And I just wanted to talk about, I suppose, my reintroduction to the hobby, which was through one of Prodos's other games, my excitement for AVP, and then kind of what happened and how it sort of fizzled out into where we are today, where really it's not mentioned or talked about at all. And the company that made it, although is no longer around, they kind of are in a different guise, and I can talk about all that here. In the world of tabletop gaming, landing a major Hollywood license is supposed to be a dream. Aliens vs Predator. It really doesn't get much bigger. But for one small UK company, that dream turned into a slow-motion catastrophe that kind of changed the landscape of Kickstarter. Today we're talking about Prodos Games. It was a small wargaming company from Leamington Spa in the UK, and how their handling of Aliens vs Predator became a case study in how licensed products can really destroy a studio. This wasn't completely about missed deadlines. This is about IP control, cash flow collapse, legal pressures, and why having the license really doesn't mean you actually own anything at all. So before AVP was a thing, the company Prodos Games, their first product was also a Kickstarter, and it was the reintroduction of the Mutant Chronicles war game, Mutant Chronicles Warzone Resurrection. Now, I wasn't a Kickstarter backer for that. I think at the time the only thing, when that went up at Kickstarter, the only thing I'd ever backed was Kingdom Death Monster. And I spent so much money with that, it kind of tapped me out. But I kept an eye on Mutant Chronicles, and when it went to retail, I was able to walk into my local gaming store, which for me at the time was right around the corner from my flat, and go and pick up a starter set. My first starter set was the Mishima starter set, because I'm a bit of a weeb and it was Japanesey, and I'm all about that, so I went for those. And I'd never really handled too much resin before then. I'd had a little bit from Forge World, so I kind of knew what to expect. But I was blown away by the quality of what I'd actually got in my starter set. The models were crisp, they were easy to put together. Superglue kind of bonded them perfectly. I was so surprised and overjoyed. Then I found out that actually the experience that people had had on Kickstarter was entirely different to my kind of effortless walking into a shop, seeing a starter, which at the time as well was like 30 quid. It was really cheap. And being able to walk into my local shop and buy it and take it home with no problems. I didn't realise the length of issues that people had online, and the fact that some of the miniatures ranges from this game had actually needed to be recast or resculpted because of so many issues. So already there was a precedent there for making mistakes when it comes to rolling out miniatures. But as a starter company, as a small startup, you can kind of forgive that. Now, Warzone Resurrection was actually my reintroduction to wargaming. I used to work in a local gaming shop in a different town, and I was heavily into Warhammer 40,000 and Fantasy 7th edition at the time. And due to sort of at the time there was a really toxic group of players at the local shop, and they actually put me off of playing and made me also decide that working at that shop really also wasn't for me. That's something I can talk about at a later date. There are a lot of weird things that happen when you work in a friendly local or not so friendly local gaming shop. But I'd spent a couple of years out of the hobby and was always really keen to get back into it, but I was wanting to make sure that when I did, I had a decent group of people to play with, as opposed to people I really wasn't interested in spending any time with. So despite that, I wanted to pick up Warzone Resurrection. So I went in, like I say, I bought my box. I also then found a gaming group to play with, and even well over 12 years later, I'm still playing with that same gaming group. So I was very fortunate to find a good group of people to play games with. Now, once I bought into Warzone Resurrection, I quickly realised that the same company had just acquired the license to Aliens versus Predator. Obviously, I grew up in the early 90s, where we could, and my mum, even as a youngster, didn't really mind what I rented. So very early doors, I watched the Aliens trilogy, as it was then, and both of the Predator films. So they'd been a staple of my childhood. So to find out that finally, after years, we were going to be able to get them on the table and have a tabletop game was a really exciting thing. And even more exciting when I realised that I actually loved Warzone Resurrection. I really loved playing it. I thought it was a great game. It had its issues, but most games do. And I really liked the alternate activations, sort of mid-scale war game. Everything that I really wanted from Warhammer, I got with Warzone. So I was really into it, and so excited by the idea that it could be, the AVP game could be the same engine as Warzone, the same quality of miniatures. So when it went to Kickstarter in 2013, for me it was an instant back, and I went in and spent, I think, about £200 at the time, which I then later increased in pledge managers. As months go by, I'm still playing Warzone Resurrection, heavily interested in continuing to play that game, and keeping my eye on what's going on with AVP. And actually the guys from Prodos, a couple of them, came across to our local gaming store to run a Warzone event and also talk about Aliens versus Predator, and brought some pre-production miniatures for us to come and see. Little did I know, actually, I say pre-production miniatures, these were pretty much exactly the same as what we ended up receiving. So the hype was in full swing. A lot of my friends had also backed AVP, so we were extremely excited to receive our rewards. Now, as time went by, it became clear that deadlines had started to slip and slip and slip, and issues came up again and again from Prodos, essentially alluding to licensing issues. Now, as time went by, sort of public sentiment grew and grew and grew in a negative way. People wanting their rewards. We were well overdue to receive anything, I think a year, and there hadn't really been too much information. But eventually we were told that we were going to get our board game shipped. So that was the first thing to arrive. And I believe in the box it was something like, you got like 10 drones, 10 stalker aliens, 3 predators, and a squad of colonial marines. And it was a board game that could be played from 1 to 3 players, which, when I got it, again, it was exciting because there were nice miniatures. The quality was great. Those miniatures were really good. Even the board components, the boards that slotted together to make you sort of your ship, it was kind of like a dungeon crawl, were quite nice. They'd actually done a really good job with the production. Where it all really kind of fell apart was the rules, and the excitement really disappeared quite quickly when our gaming group got it to the table and realised that it was extremely half-baked and really, really hard actually to understand due to the way it was laid out. I found out a couple of truths about this book, which I'll sort of come to later. But suffice to say, the hype was certainly... so it was almost like someone threw a bucket of water over us, really. We were very gutted. I was very gutted. The actual game. The miniatures were great. And then we sort of consoled ourselves. I certainly consoled myself with the premise that it's okay. Maybe the board game is not great, but when we get the wargaming rules and the wargaming and the rules book for the war game, that'll make up for everything, because that'll be like Warzone, which I already enjoy, and everything will be fine. However, just like the issues with licensing on the board game, where they would make something, they would, whether it be art, whether it would be one of the miniatures, they had to go to the approval stage with Fox for everything. And I don't think, from the sounds of it, and certainly what's been spoken about and written about since, that they were expecting quite just the level of scrutiny that they received. So again, everything had to be approved. Any changes then had to be approved, and it was a constant backwards and forwards between 20th Century Fox and Prodos. So it was a Herculean task just for us to get our board game. These challenges quite clearly remained once the miniatures were being developed for the war game, or the extra miniatures. So a long time had passed. Now we're talking about a year and a half, and people had lost their patience completely. I had lost my patience. This was one of the first Kickstarters that I'd backed. I wasn't really expecting to wait quite so long. And certainly at pretty much every forum, Facebook groups that I could see was a bunch of really unhappy people. The Kickstarter comments were very, very toxic. Very toxic. People were very upset that they hadn't received their rewards yet. And also, really, the lack of transparency from Prodos, who, again, were quite public in other areas. They were showing off new Warzone Resurrection miniatures, which was still doing quite well for them. And still obviously selling the remnants of the stock of the AVP board game. But they weren't really talking too much about what was happening with the miniatures, and updates were quite sporadic. So it really was a nightmare. This approval stage of getting everything approved, every single miniature, every single box, all the SKUs, all the art, the font, the placement of that font, everything was an absolute nightmare. But here's where it went crazy, and it's one of the biggest things that happened during the Kickstarter before everything was fulfilled. Fox were objecting to some of the unapproved imagery on the actual Kickstarter page long after the campaign had launched and been funded. And Kickstarter at the time, I don't know whether it's changed, but they wouldn't actually allow their page or your project page to be edited. I suppose because, you know, you could promise something during the funding stage and then afterwards change it and be like, oh no, we always promised we'd only deliver this instead. However, Prodos had no choice, and they needed to essentially remove the images or edit their Kickstarter page. So they really only had one choice, and that was to remove the page completely by issuing a copyright strike against their own page, which completely removed the project. You can't see the project now on Kickstarter. You kind of get a bit of a splash screen, but no information whatsoever. It's gone. It removed the public visibility of any promises that they made. It deleted all of the comments and all the obviously the history of the comments. It completely destroyed the transparency, any transparency, and it made pretty much most backers assume that something illegal had happened. And due to the lack of communication, it only compounded that issue. It's kind of almost unheard of, and it completely shattered trust immediately. And I think that's where the lesson was learned, both obviously majorly on Prodos' side, but also us as backers, that if you're dealing with a licensed product, the company that's delivering that licensed product actually doesn't even own its own marketing, let alone anything else. So, just before I go any further, I've mentioned before that I'd get to a little bit of the craziness about the Aliens vs Predator The Hunt Begins board game, the rulebook for that. So I found out at a later date that the night before it was meant to go to the printers for final printing, that was the deadline, that's the time they had booked. It was actually still being proofread and had been sent around the studio pretty much to everyone to try to fix it. And when it eventually went from the Polish staff to the UK staff, they were confronted with a book that was essentially, as I heard it, as it was described to me, it was full of Polglish. So half English, half Polish, sort of half-baked translation. They'd essentially done the best they could in-house, but it certainly wasn't up to scratch. So that was, as much as it could have been, fixed in a short amount of time by some probably extremely stressed out staff. But I mean, they're not the only company that have released rulebooks where, because English isn't their native language, it's sort of a bit of this and a little bit of that. Infinity comes to mind. I played Infinity back before, well, first edition, the end of the first edition, and trying to decipher the rulebook was an absolute nightmare. I mean, it's hard enough getting into Infinity now, and that's with the wealth of, you know, videos that are out there, tutorials, them streamlining the rules. But this was first edition, and it was essentially a Spanish rulebook slammed through Google Translate and sent out to retail. And by all accounts, the AVP book was basically the same. So another big no-no happened after this. and it's something that continues to happen to this day. And actually, when it comes to Kickstarter, even though I understand why companies do this, it still grinds my gears, which is selling to retail before backers receive their rewards. So I think for a lot of people, certainly I was in a group on Facebook actually called Crew Expendable. Some of you listening may have even been in this group, which was a group of extremely disgruntled backers, sharing information that they've been able to get from any source imaginable, and obviously venting all frustrations. But backers who had sort of paid years earlier, obviously reporting that still no pledges were arriving, emails were going unanswered to the company, so still a lack of transparency. Shipping updates from the company through email were kind of vague at best, and you could go 6 months without hearing of any further information. And then all of a sudden, Aliens vs Predator, as in the extra miniatures, all of the essentially the stuff that you would need to start wargaming, started appearing at retail. In some cases, like local stores all around the country started receiving stock. Online shops everywhere were selling expansions and taking pre-orders for expansions with imminent release dates, but backers had nothing. They had absolutely nothing. Nothing was sent out. Now, obviously, this is catastrophic, really, for any company at this point, I think, based on the previous failures, because Kickstarter really is, it relies and operates on trust, and in a perfect world, priority fulfillment. Selling retail first basically only proved what people had been whispering about, and the rumours that had been flying around, it seemed to corroborate those, that essentially there was a severe cash flow issue, or money was being funneled somewhere else. Now, this was always thrown around the place at the time, and the company themselves, the spokespeople for that company, would say, no, this isn't happening, funds haven't been misappropriated. But it later came to light that the money from AVP, quite a lot of it, was used to finalise and finish the fulfilment of Warzone Resurrection's Kickstarter. Now, because I was a retail buyer for it, I wasn't aware of the issues that Kickstarter backers have been going through, but much like AVP, a long time afterwards, backers still hadn't received anything, and you could buy it in a shop long before they were sent it. And again, AVP's Kickstarter helped to fund finishing the fulfillment of all of the ranges on that were original Kickstarter, and also funding new product for Warzone to come out at the shop shelves, obviously in an attempt to build some sort of cash flow to then eventually fund AVP. All, you can understand it, but still very, very, very scary and quite sketchy. Now, they're not obviously the only people that do this. There are so many examples of Kickstarters doing and behaving in a very similar fashion. So, all of this to say, the backers weren't happy. Prodos was clearly flying by the seat of their pants, and something had to give. So eventually, people started to receive their rewards. I got mine. I've got to say that in terms of the miniature quality, again, just like everything that I'd pretty much ever received from Prodos, I couldn't have asked for more. It was fantastic, really detailed, very, very easy to put together, and very hard wearing, very durable. Some of my miniatures survived drops absolutely fine. So on that side, absolutely no complaints. But it became, again, very clear that the company was struggling, and even though the game was only really in its infancy, Prodos lost the AVP license. Fox had pulled the plug. The remaining stock was just sold off at discount rates on their website. Anything that was planned going forward, stuff that I was quite excited to be able to buy and paint, was cancelled, and communication pretty much stopped dead. Now, this is where Prodos kind of changed a little bit, and they were still a company. However, a new company appeared with a new Kickstarter, and they were called Archon. And they came out, I believe their first Kickstarter was a game called Load. And people quickly realised that Prodos had sort of transmuted into Archon, and started to try to review bomb the game on Board Game Geek, the new game Load that they were putting out, and obviously then going into their Kickstarter, so putting $1 on that Kickstarter to go into the comments to tell everyone essentially buyer beware, which I think did definitely affect the amount of money that they were able to raise on Load. I would imagine through outside investment, through money that was gained through AVP, Archon were able to put money, and obviously through further Kickstarters, they actually started to put money into plastic production. So another game came out a little bit later. One of their other Kickstarted, Chronicle X, had quite a few hard plastic miniatures. They had a lot of resin, similar-ish in composition to the AVP stuff, but a bit more hard-wearing, a bit more solid. But it also had plastic, and it was some of the first plastic I'd seen from Archon. So you could kind of see what direction they're moving into. Fast forward to today, they have major plastic production capability. They supply, obviously, and where they manufacture not just their own plastic miniatures for their own games, but also for other companies like Conquest and Trench Crusade and others. So realistically, going from looking at it from where it was in the Prodos to Archon transition, where things seem quite hairy, today in 2026, seems weird to say 2026, they're actually in a good place. But a lot of people, through the company name change and through the company switch, they were able to essentially start again. And I do believe, even though there are quite a lot of people out there that do know that they were Prodos, and all of the negativity that happened with the Warzone Kickstarter to the AVP Kickstarter, they've managed to turn it around in terms of they've managed to avoid major negativity, overcome the issues, and become essentially an entirely different company that release a lot to retail. StarCraft is their latest game to come out at retail. That'll be coming out relatively soon. I think pre-orders are going up soon. It's interesting because even when they were Prodos, they had their eyes on StarCraft. So at one of the gaming shows in the UK, Salute, I think it was Salute 2015, they showed off a range of, they were obviously prototypes made on a 3D printer, but they showed a range of, I believe it was either 10mm or 15mm miniatures for StarCraft at that time, with the intent of making a smaller scale StarCraft game. It was something they wanted to do. I believe they were speaking to licensors, and it was Blizzard in that case, as it was Activision Blizzard. But nothing ever happened. Obviously, it's taken them from then, so 11 years, to be able to have a sort of a tangible StarCraft product, but they've had their eye on it for a very long time. But in 2026, AVP is pretty much all but forgotten about. Its entire range of miniatures, from sentry guns to power loaders, predators. You know, they had a really decent range of miniatures, and they're very expensive now. If you wanted to chase them on eBay, they're quite expensive. I sold all of mine just due to space. We were never gonna play it, so it went all of that excitement, and really it amounted for our gaming group to nothing. I'd imagine happened to a lot of people. But really, it's a huge shame, and I think ultimately this story is just I suppose a cautionary tale for game companies, startups, smaller companies in particular, that just because you manage to get the license doesn't mean it's all roses, and in fact it can actually cause you serious problems. And I can think of other companies, Steamforged Games, that have issues with licensed games. So I really like the Resident Evil board games. The designer is a guy called Sherwin Matthews, and he really made some good games. The production quality on the earlier one, so Resident Evil 2's, to be desired. I think it's not as good as it could have been. But certainly the game itself is a hell of a lot of fun, especially if you are a Resident Evil fan like me. They released, obviously, Resident Evil 2 first, and then Resident Evil 3, and then Resident Evil, as in the first one, with the promise that they would come out with Resident Evil 4. But as I understand it, that game may never come out, because the people they dealt with at Capcom, they are no longer dealing with at Capcom. So there's a change of staff there somewhere within that licensing department, and there hasn't really been any news about Resident Evil 4 in a year. With them planning their own survival horror board game in their own universe, it kind of speaks volumes that they're having serious trouble trying to get the license again for any further Capcom titles. And again, not just those guys, and this isn't throwing shade at them. I do like the Resident Evil games. The Monster Hunter game's kind of fun. Elden Ring's cool. The only game I think I didn't like from those guys was Dark Souls. But that's a story for another video, because much like AVP, it was a Kickstarter that released to some serious hype. It made a lot of money on Kickstarter, and ultimately failed, I believe, with its execution. The game was substandard. The production was very nice, but the game itself was almost non-existent. But I think we'll talk about that one in the future. But just to wrap this one up, because I've waffled on for long enough. In conclusion, the Alien vs Predator miniatures were genuinely excellent, but the excellence of those miniatures didn't matter, because ultimately they failed in just about every other endeavour. And I think that is due to lack of experience, lack of understanding when it comes to licenses, because license work means you don't own your own product, you don't control your own timeline, you can't control your own future. Prodos didn't just mishandle a game, they demonstrated exactly why small studios should fear those big licenses. And that's where I'm going to leave it for this one. Obviously, I've got a couple more stories about the sort of almost the other side of the curtain when it comes to AVP. Things that I found out speaking to the staff at war game shows and bits and pieces about just how crazy it was behind the scenes. But this video sort of gone on a little bit too long, probably a little bit longer than I expected it to. But I suppose what I want to know from you guys is, did you play the AVP game or anything that Prodos made? Did you play Warzone Resurrection? I'm probably going to do a video about that at some point in the future, because I thought it was a great game and I'm really gutted that it isn't around anymore. And I know there is a upcoming Warzone game coming out, but it's a totally different change in scale. I don't really like the miniatures that they've shown for that. So I'm really gutted about the Prodos version of Mutant Chronicles. But did you guys play either of the games? Did you have the miniatures? Maybe you were one of the few who didn't even know it existed. Maybe you've just got into Wargaming and had no idea that for a limited period of time there was an Aliens vs Predator game. I've played a lot of games and been involved in a lot of, in terms of playing and with a lot of games like this, sort of smaller niche games. And if there is a game or a company that you want me to talk about, if I've got that information, if I've had that experience with that game or that company, then I'll 100% talk about it, because I find all of this kind of stuff really interesting. If you feel like I've missed something, let me know. Maybe I got something wrong with the timelines. Maybe you're a backer and you had a different perspective. Give me a shout. But thank you very much for, well, if you got this far in the video, I do appreciate it. I probably will make another video. It's been fun interacting with you guys that are commenting, and obviously if you did like it, then if you sling me a like, I'd really appreciate it. But thank you very much, and hopefully I'll catch you on the next one.